Welcome back to the channel. Join me as we uncover the cases of the most dumb deaths ever recorded. From a gambler who climbed into a tiger cage to avoid zoo gate fees to a woman who prioritized fashion over safety as she flexed her designer scarf in an open convertible. It was September 22nd, 2018, on a downtown Austin parking garage rooftop, where warm evening air, light wind, and fading sunset colors framed an exposed 7-story concrete platform. Sutton Graves, 29, worked in digital marketing and had spent weeks planning what he believed would be a carefully controlled rooftop proposal. Colleagues described him as methodical and detail-oriented, someone who preferred orchestrating moments rather than improvising them. He chose the parking garage for its predictable access, open sightlines, and the belief that he could manage every variable himself. His girlfriend of 2 years joined him expecting a quiet sunset walk, unaware that Sutton had arranged string lights and rose petals ahead of time, convinced that a structured plan would prevent anything from going wrong. An action camera had been mounted on a tripod, positioned to capture both the sunset backdrop and Sutton's planned proposal location. The rooftop level also served as active parking, with several vehicles scattered across marked spaces. To create a dramatic entrance, Sutton had coordinated with his best friend Max to drive Sutton's modified 2015 Dodge Challenger onto the rooftop at a specific time. The plan involved Max performing a controlled burnout maneuver to create tire smoke as a theatrical backdrop, after which Sutton would propose while the camera captured the scene. Max had limited experience with performance driving, despite Sutton's assurances. The Challenger had been modified with enhanced exhaust and performance tires, producing 375 horsepower. Max positioned the vehicle approximately 40 feet from where Sutton and his girlfriend stood near the decorative setup. As the golden hour lighting peaked, Max received Sutton's signal. He engaged the line lock system to hold the front brakes while applying throttle to spin the rear tires. White clouds of tire smoke drifted across the rooftop as intended, creating the atmospheric effect Sutton had envisioned. However, Max had left the vehicle in drive and failed to maintain consistent brake pressure during the maneuver. When he pressed harder on the accelerator, the rear tires regained traction while the vehicle surged forward. The Challenger lurched forward with sudden acceleration, rear tires gripping concrete as 375 horsepower propelled the 3,700-pound vehicle directly toward Sutton's position. Max frantically attempted to brake, but the overheated front brakes responded sluggishly, delaying full braking effectiveness. Sutton turned at the revving engine sound and had less than 2 seconds to react. He attempted to push his girlfriend aside but had no time to move himself. The Challenger's front end struck Sutton at an estimated speed of 25 to 30 miles per hour, the impact launching him onto the hood, before his body rolled over the windshield and off the vehicle's rear. The collision caused massive multiple system trauma, including severe chest and abdominal injuries, pelvic fractures, and traumatic aortic rupture. Max brought the vehicle to a stop 20 feet beyond the impact point, the windshield starred with cracks. Sutton's girlfriend screamed in horror. The action camera captured the entire sequence from initial burnout through the horrific collision. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes, but pronounced Sutton deceased at the scene due to massive internal injuries and traumatic aortic dissection. The investigation revealed the modified vehicle's braking system had not been properly upgraded for performance driving conditions. The action camera footage was recovered and reviewed by authorities during the investigation, confirming the mechanical failure sequence and later referenced in discussions about the dangers of stunt-based proposals and improper vehicle use. It was September 17, 2013, at a private waste transfer station on the industrial edge of Newark, New Jersey, where the air carried diesel exhaust and the machinery ran loud enough that workers communicated mostly through hand signals. A string of heavy construction loads had pushed the facility behind schedule, and the tension on the floor had been building since the morning handoff. Brenda Kessick was 39 and had worked at the facility for 9 years, longer than most of her current crew. She was a shift supervisor known for pushing people hard, but also for knowing the line operations inside and out better than almost anyone on site. Her relationship with safety protocols was complicated. She didn't ignore them outright, but she bent them when she believed experience outweighed procedure, which was often. Management had written her up twice and placed her on a final written warning after disputes over overtime enforcement and equipment handling instructions. She took each write-up without argument, signed what she needed to sign, and went back to work the same way she always had. The debris load jamming the rear compactor that afternoon was not unusual. Splintered plywood, fractured drywall, and broken cabinet frames stacked unevenly inside a partially cycled bin. Pressure sensors flagged an imbalance and triggered an alarm with an interlock maintenance shutdown hold. The system allowed a manual override that had not been properly secured. Brenda arrived, assessed in roughly 15 seconds, and climbed the side ladder rather than call it in. Her reasoning was likely consistent with her pattern: redistribute the load or fall further behind schedule. When I first read through this one, my reaction wasn't sympathy. It was something closer to exhaustion. 9 years of warnings, and not one of them changed anything. A younger employee, Nico Salas, was standing approximately 12 feet away when Brenda swung herself into the chamber. He told investigators he had seen her do this before and told her directly that the warning indicator was still active. She kicked debris toward the steel ram and kept working. The compactor had been left in automatic cycle mode. Nobody had disabled it. Nico described standing there watching her redistribute debris with her boots, waiting for her to step back and climb out. Aware something was wrong and no longer certain how to make her stop, the compactor registered the corrected pressure balance and resumed its hydraulic sequence. Witnesses heard the deep mechanical engagement, the same sound at the start of every cycle, followed immediately by a single scream from inside the bin. The steel ram descended. In a split second, she had time to look up and attempt to move backward, but the interior gave her less than 2 feet of lateral space. Compression registered within seconds, and the force exceeded several thousand psi. Bones fractured within the first moments of contact. Nico hit the emergency stop. Another worker cut the main line. Neither reversed what had already happened. Nico called 911, and emergency and fire crews arrived in 8 minutes. Extraction of the body from the unit took over an hour due to the machinery's design. The coroner's findings described severe crush trauma to the thorax and abdomen, bilateral rib fractures with pulmonary involvement, pelvic fracture, and injuries consistent with high-force mechanical compression. Death occurred before extraction was complete. Authorities cited multiple violations, noting that every posted safety requirement beside the unit had been bypassed. I don't think Brenda deserved to die the way she did. Nobody does. But I also can't pretend the warnings weren't there. From coworkers, from management, from the machine itself. At the facility, conversations in the weeks that followed were quiet and uncomfortable, not because her death was unexpected, but because it wasn't, and that was the part nobody knew how to say. It was on the 20th of July, 2017 in Sichuan Province, China. The summer heat hung over the city, and posters advertising the zoo's new Bengal tiger covered the streets. Mr. Zhang Weihao, 37 years old, worked long shifts at a small manufacturing plant outside the city and rarely spent money on himself. But when the zoo began advertising its new Bengal tiger exhibit, he became fixated on seeing it in person. He had never seen a Bengal tiger up close before, and over the following weeks, he planned the visit carefully, even booking a day off work more than a week in advance. I am amazed at how a simple public attraction can take on personal significance to the extent of influencing decisions weeks in advance. He saved money carefully, enough for transport, food, and admission. But Zhang had a gambling habit, and in the days leading up to the visit, he kept dipping into the savings, small bets that felt harmless, and then larger ones to recover what he had lost. And by the morning of his scheduled day off, most of the admission money was gone, but he went anyway. He told himself he would find a way, and he traveled to the zoo and stood outside the entrance and checked his pockets and knew, with a sinking certainty, that he did not have enough to get in. I have stood outside things I could not afford to enter. Most people have, and I understand the particular sting of it when you have been looking forward to something for weeks. What I cannot follow, and what I suspect most people cannot follow either, is what happened next. Most people would have gone home, but Zhang had spent weeks thinking about this day, and he was not ready to give it up, so he began walking the perimeter fence, slowly and deliberately, looking for a way inside that would not require a ticket. Warning signs were fixed to the fencing at regular intervals. Danger, predatory animals, authorized personnel only, do not climb. And a maintenance worker who spotted him testing the fence sections told him directly that the area beyond the barrier connected to the animal containment zones. I want to be fair about that exchange. The worker did not gesture vaguely at a sign. He told Zhang directly, in plain terms, what was on the other side of the fence. Zhang heard it, processed it, and kept walking. That is the part I find genuinely difficult to move past. Zhang ignored him and kept walking. He found a rear section of fencing that felt less visible from the main pathways, and he decided this was the place, and he began to climb. The fence was taller than he had expected and curved outward at the top, and security footage later showed him struggling several times before finally pulling himself onto the upper rail, breathing hard, looking down at the other side. That is the moment I would want to reach back and say something, because sometimes a person needs to hear a warning one more time from somewhere inside themselves before it is too late. He had assumed there would be a service walkway below, flat ground, somewhere to land and catch his breath. But there was no walkway, only the enclosed interior safety zone of the Bengal tiger habitat, and before he could process what he was seeing, his grip gave way, and he fell. The drop stunned him on impact. 3 tigers that had been resting nearby reacted instantly to the noise and sudden movement. At first, the visitors watching thought the fall was part of a show until the tigers began attacking Zhang. Zoo staff had attempted to distract the animals using noise devices and feeding lures, while the surrounding viewing platforms were evacuated. But the response window was extremely short, and the enclosure had been engineered specifically to prevent any escape from within once entry had occurred. By the time emergency responders were able to disperse the tigers, he was already dead. Investigators confirmed the enclosure had functioned exactly as designed. The fencing, the warning signs, and the perimeter barriers all met local safety requirements, and no evidence of structural failure or staff negligence was found. The death was classified as an accidental fatality caused by unauthorized entry into a secured predator enclosure. The tigers were not euthanized, as the animals had behaved naturally within their own habitat. The zoo temporarily closed the tiger exhibit for inspection and later added anti-climb modifications to several rear perimeter sections to avoid another animal containment breach. It was October 11, 2019, at a vocational secondary school in Łódź, Poland, and the building had already gone quiet. 3 boys were still inside. One of them would not leave the same way he came in. Marek Vidan was 16, a second-year student in the school's electrical trades program. Now it's hard not to mention his living situation going into his story. You have to know first that his mother worked overnight shifts at a nearby textile plant, which left most of his evenings unsupervised. Older boys in his neighborhood had started including him in their routines, wandering, filming, posting. He had been chasing a moment worth uploading for weeks. The plan was to film themselves stealing school property for a prank video they intended to upload to TikTok. The 3 boys had identified their target earlier that week, a large analog wall clock mounted outside the second-floor gymnasium hallway. Marek brought the screwdriver. I've seen a lot of stories where the setup sounds almost too mundane, and this one is exactly that. A clock, a screwdriver, and a phone camera. That's all it took. They got the clock off the wall. Apparently, the process took longer than expected. The screws were old, and the mounting system used a bracket that had been partially stripped from prior service work, corroded into the plaster. One of the boys filmed while Marek worked at it. The footage recovered later showed the hallway, the clock tilting free, and Marek laughing at the noise it made. Then came the sound of a door opening somewhere below them. The janitor on duty said that he had been making his rounds near the gymnasium stairwell when he heard the metallic scraping. He moved toward it. The boys heard him, dropped the clock on the hallway floor, and ran for the back courtyard exit. The back perimeter wall was approximately 12 feet of poured concrete, its upper edge covered in old moss and mildew from a drainage issue. One of the other boys cleared it. The second hesitated and doubled back toward the gate. Marek went straight up. The phone footage captured the audio of the next several seconds. Shoes scraping against concrete, a grunt near the top, then a sound the janitor later described to investigators as a flat, heavy crack, like a palm slapped hard against a table, except it wasn't that. Marek had already shifted most of his weight forward over the wall's edge when his left shoe lost traction on the wet surface. He did not fall backward. He went over the top head first, the back of his skull contacting the pavement on the far side before the rest of his body finished the rotation. The janitor saw the moment of impact. He called emergency services immediately. The ambulance arrived, and Marek was transported to the regional trauma center, where surgeons worked for several hours. Unfortunately, he died during surgery from catastrophic cerebral edema, uncontrolled brain swelling following severe blunt cranial trauma. The fracture was to the occipital bone. The janitor returned to work the following week. He gave his formal statement twice, once to responding officers, once to school administrators, and did not speak publicly about what he saw beyond that. He continued working at the school for at least another year. The two other boys were identified and questioned. Neither faced criminal charges. My honest opinion is that the older boys in Marek's life had handed him a framework where recklessness was social currency, and he spent it without ever being told the actual cost. That's not an excuse for the decision he made, but those people shaped his risk tolerance, watched him absorb it, and walked away from this without consequence. It was June 8, 2015, when nature claimed its most stubborn victim on the pristine fairways of Tampa's exclusive West Shore Country Club. Colton Hayes, a 28-year-old regional sales manager for a prominent medical device company, embodied the relentless drive that made him successful in business. Standing 6 feet 1 inch with a stocky athletic build, Colton possessed an almost pathological inability to quit anything he started. This trait served him well in closing million-dollar deals, but it would prove fatal on that sweltering Florida afternoon. Colton had earned his reputation as the golfer who played through anything. Rain, wind, even hail couldn't drive him from the course. His twice-weekly rounds at West Shore were sacred rituals, and today's tournament qualifier represented months of preparation. He'd been chasing this opportunity since February, practicing his short game until his hands bled, determined to earn his spot in the regional championship. The meteorologists had been clear that morning. Severe thunderstorms would pummel the Tampa Bay area by 4 p.m. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Colton teed off at 2 p.m., but he dismissed the warnings with characteristic confidence. He'd outrun storms before. His playing partners had already retreated to the clubhouse, but Colton pressed on alone, muttering about fair-weather golfers. By 3:45 p.m., Colton stood on the 14th tee as the first lightning strikes flickered within 5 miles. The course management sounded the warning horn, its urgent wail echoing across the manicured landscape. Other golfers abandoned their carts and sprinted toward the clubhouse, but Colton barely glanced up. He had 4 holes remaining, and his score was too good to waste. The wind intensified as he approached the 16th green, bending palm trees at impossible angles. Rain began in fat, warm drops that quickly became a torrential downpour. Lightning crackled overhead with increasing frequency, each flash illuminating Colton's determined silhouette as he lined up his crucial putt. At 4:10 p.m., as Colton crouched over his putter just 3 feet from the metal flagstick, the storm unleashed its full fury. The lightning bolt that found him carried 30,000 amperes of pure electrical energy, striking the flagstick and traveling through the saturated ground into his metal spikes. The current surged through Colton's body like liquid fire, entering through his feet and exiting through his hands gripping the metal putter. His heart stopped instantly. The electrical pathway carved devastating burns along his torso, hands, and feet, while the massive discharge hurled his 190-pound frame 8 feet backward from the flagstick. Golfers watching from the clubhouse windows witnessed the brilliant flash that consumed their colleague. They found Colton motionless on the rain-soaked green, his clothing still smoldering, severe burns marking the lightning's deadly path through his body. The acrid smell of burned flesh mixed with ozone filled the humid air. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, their advanced life support equipment battling against nature's overwhelming force. For 45 minutes, they administered CPR and repeated defibrillation attempts. But Colton's competitive spirit had finally met an opponent it couldn't overcome. The tragedy transformed West Shore Country Club's safety protocols forever. Lightning detection systems now mandate immediate course evacuation when electrical activity appears within 8 miles. In the end, the man who never quit anything had finally encountered something that wouldn't quit on him. It was August 6, 2016, when the incident occurred at a private coastal airstrip in southern Monterey County, California. The facility consisted of a single paved runway measuring approximately 3,200 feet in length. That morning, temperatures had dropped to approximately 41 degrees Fahrenheit overnight due to coastal marine conditions. A thin layer of cold-soaked moisture coated exposed surfaces, including parked aircraft. The sun had not yet risen. Visibility was limited to runway lights and hangar floodlights. Heath Ledgerwood, 44 years old, owned a small aircraft and worked in commercial real estate development. His job involved managing property acquisitions along the Central California coast. He was known to colleagues as impatient and status-driven, often prioritizing appearance over procedural caution. He had owned his single-engine aircraft for approximately 2 years and held a private pilot license with just over 200 logged flight hours. That morning, he had arrived at the airstrip before dawn to film a takeoff video for social media. The plane had been stored in an unheated hangar overnight. When the hangar doors were opened, frost was visible on the wings and fuselage. A ground operator mentioned that the aircraft would require a warm-up cycle before flight. Ledgerwood dismissed the suggestion. He entered the cockpit and began the engine start sequence immediately. The engine turned over and idled roughly. Oil pressure readings were below the normal operating range. The ground operator gestured toward the instrument panel. Ledgerwood waved him off. He did not complete a pre-flight checklist. He did not inspect the wings for frost. He advanced the throttle and began taxiing toward the runway within minutes of engine start. He reached the runway threshold and turned onto the centerline without pausing. He applied full throttle. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. Near liftoff speed, the engine torque fluctuated. A brief loss of power caused the aircraft to yaw slightly to the left. Ledgerwood attempted to correct with rudder input, but the response was sluggish. The aircraft continued drifting left as it began to rotate. The left wing dropped lower than intended. It struck a runway edge light mounted on a short metal post. The impact was violent. The wing buckled inward. The aircraft pitched forward and slammed nose first into the compacted dirt adjacent to the runway. The cockpit structure collapsed inward. The control column was forced rearward. Ledgerwood's chest struck the control column with extreme force. Multiple ribs fractured. His sternum cracked vertically. The aorta ruptured at the point where it exits the heart. He sustained catastrophic injuries and was later pronounced dead at the scene. The ground operator witnessed the crash and immediately radioed emergency services at approximately 6:18 a.m. Local fire and rescue units arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics found Ledgerwood unresponsive, still secured in his seat. No pulse was detected. The aircraft was secured, and the runway was closed temporarily. The airstrip resumed operations later that morning. An investigation by federal aviation authorities concluded that the engine had not reached proper operating temperature prior to takeoff, contributing to rough power delivery. Frost on the wings disrupted airflow, reducing lift. The combination caused loss of directional control during takeoff. The official report cited pilot error, specifically failure to complete pre-flight procedures and disregard for environmental conditions. Heath Ledgerwood was confirmed dead from blunt force chest trauma sustained in the crash. It was December 9, 2017, when the indoor botanical atrium in downtown Chicago maintained a controlled environment of 72 degrees Fahrenheit beneath its expansive glass dome. The 3-story space housed tropical plants and featured suspended glass walkways that crossed the atrium roughly 40 feet above the main floor. Ethan Rhodes, 34, worked in corporate event coordination and had secured after-hours access under the pretense of a private photography session. Known among colleagues for his confidence and attention to detail, Ethan believed careful planning could eliminate risk. Over several weeks, he designed an elaborate proposal meant to contrast winter imagery against the atrium's tropical setting. His girlfriend was asked to wait below and test camera framing on her phone. Unaware the decorations above her were part of the proposal Ethan was still adjusting on the suspended walkway. The glass walkway was constructed from individual laminated glass panels mounted within a steel support frame, each panel measuring approximately 8 feet by 4 feet. Posted signage specified load limits intended for evenly distributed pedestrian traffic and warned against placing concentrated weight on any single panel. Despite this, Ethan arranged bags of damp artificial snow and weighted decorative elements on one central section of the walkway to create a staged proposal backdrop. Investigators later determined that the decorative arrangement concentrated significant static weight onto a single glass panel that already contained fatigue cracking at a stainless steel mounting bolt, undetectable during routine inspections. The added load did not cause immediate failure, but placed sustained stress on the panel and surrounding frame. An Insta360 camera had been positioned on the atrium's main floor, angled upward to capture the proposal from approximately 40 feet below. The wide-angle lens recorded both the glass walkway and the botanical displays beneath it, documenting the scene continuously. As the lighting reached the planned level, Ethan stepped onto the decorated panel and moved toward the center of the display. When he shifted his weight and began lowering himself to one knee, the compromised panel partially failed. Rather than shattering completely, the glass dropped unevenly within the steel frame, producing sharp fractures along one edge and a sudden tilt in the walkway surface. Ethan's lower body became trapped as the panel dropped several inches within the frame. His leg and pelvis were pinned between fractured glass and the steel support structure, while his upper body remained suspended above the opening. The camera captured his sudden collapse against the frame as the structure settled under the uneven load. Security personnel monitoring surveillance feeds noticed the incident within moments and reached the atrium floor quickly. However, the instability of the damaged walkway prevented immediate access. Emergency responders arrived minutes later and secured the structure before reaching Ethan. He was pronounced deceased at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic crush injuries combined with a massive laceration to the upper thigh, severing a major blood vessel and causing rapid, non-compressible hemorrhage. There was no evidence of a fall from height. The investigation concluded that the death resulted from concentrated decorative loading placed on a walkway not designed to support static installations. While the atrium structure itself met safety standards, the misuse of the walkway violated posted load warnings. The footage was reviewed by investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events, and the death was ruled accidental. The case later prompted renewed discussion within event planning and facilities management circles about the risks of modifying architectural spaces without structural assessment. It was August 14, 2014, on a flat stretch of road east of Waco, Texas, where the summer heat stayed well past sundown, and a man who had spent years refining the art of the small grudge arrived at its largest possible outcome. Colter Wachowski was 41 years old and worked seasonal fencing contracts across McLennan County. For 3 years, he had converted a property line dispute with his neighbor, Wes Pritchard, into something approaching a full-time concern, filing county complaints, calling local inspectors over the smoke from Wes's backyard grill, and measuring his fence posts with a tape measure he kept in his truck. At bars, he committed fully to the cowboy image: wide-brimmed hat, boots, loud stories about the land and the principle of the thing. The stories worsened with each drink, and that night he had been drinking for close to 6 hours. The complaint was the one he always came back to. Wes had shifted a boundary marker by 6 inches, and nobody had done anything about it, and tonight was the night. His friends laughed. Colter announced he was going to settle it like a real Texan, then walked to where his gelding, Boone, was being kept at a nearby rural rodeo grounds parking lot rather than a formal stable. I'll be honest, not one person standing in that gravel lot took him seriously enough to step in front of that horse, and that failure of judgment was not his alone. Understanding the decision requires sitting with how it felt from inside it. His horse, Boone, was familiar. The route was a few hundred yards across flat ground in the dark. 3 years of accumulated grievance, measured out in tape measure increments and county paperwork, has a particular way of making an absurd idea feel proportionate. The night was thick and airless. No relief, no movement. Heat holding flat against the ground. Wes had left his front door open to draw air through the screen. The porch light threw a yellow square across the dirt yard. Several of Colter's friends had followed outside and stood at the edge of the yard near the porch rather than on it, watching. Boone was already pulling against the bit and snorting before they crossed the property line, the horse uneasy as they closed on the porch steps. Coulter kicked him forward. The horse surged a half step and then stopped violently at the porch threshold beneath the overhanging roof structure, head dropping and hindquarters bracing as it instinctively refused the confined space. The impact occurred when Boone's forehead struck the low porch header beam directly above the entryway. Boone stood roughly 5.5 feet at the withers, and with Coulter already pitched forward over the horse's neck, the sudden full stop caused his upper body to be driven forward and slightly upward into the beam rather than simply folding down. Witnesses standing in the yard near the edge of the porch light described a single, sharp crack, dry and immediate, that cut across the yard before anyone registered what they were seeing. The force of the impact snapped Coulter backward off the saddle. He landed headfirst on the concrete step directly below the entryway. Blood began pooling beneath his head within seconds. Boone shifted back, then backed off the porch entirely into the yard, unharmed and still untied. Wes's wife called emergency services from inside. Wes knelt beside Coulter and tried to keep him still while they waited. Paramedics arrived, and he was transported and died at the hospital later that night. The county medical examiner recorded the cause of death as closed traumatic brain injury. Blood alcohol concentration was documented at 0.19. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The property line is still where it was. Wes Pritchard still lives in that house. Locals passed the story around for weeks as the one about the cowboy who tried to ride indoors, which is accurate as far as it goes, but says nothing about what it looked like for the people standing in that yard when it happened. Personally, I keep returning to the group in the gravel lot. You can rule it accidental and even stupid, but the part where everyone just watched, I'm not sure that holds. It was on the 18th of August, 2017, at Lake Washington, Washington State. The afternoon light sat low across the water, warm and unhurried, the kind of summer day that felt too easy to rush. The surface was calm, no hazards reported, nothing to suggest the day would end any way other than ordinarily. Rodney Brown, 32 years, had been here before, many times. This exact lake, this exact routine. Solo jet ski rides were his way of stepping away from everything else, a structured kind of quiet he had built into his week without fanfare or explanation. He favored long looping routes away from the busier shoreline areas. Repetitive and familiar, the kind of riding that required just enough concentration to clear the mind without demanding anything more. The ride that afternoon followed his usual pattern, steady and uneventful right through to the later stages, when a battery warning light began flashing on the display panel. It came and went at first, easy to brush off, the kind of minor electrical signal that riders often put down to normal wear, rather than something that needed immediate attention. As the ride continued and the return phase began, the alert became persistent, no longer flickering but holding steady, a clear signal that something was wrong in the system. Rodney interpreted it as degradation rather than failure, a reasonable assumption in isolation, though one that would shape every decision that followed. He brought the jet ski in toward a dock area he used occasionally for maintenance access, quieter than the main marina, lower in foot traffic, the kind of spot that suited informal work without drawing much attention. The dock surface was wet, uneven in places, the natural result of a day spent around water, not unusual, not alarming under ordinary conditions. At this point, things took a turn. Rather than waiting for a proper check or asking for help from the marina, Rodney decided to restore power himself using a makeshift electrical connection, equipment that was never designed for use around water, brought into a setting where water, conductive surfaces, and live current all shared the same tight space with nothing separating them. He was crouched at the dock edge, adjusting cables, repositioning the connection. Those four things together were what I could not stop thinking about. Water, surfaces that carry electricity, live wires and equipment not meant to be near the sea, all of them at once, in that order, in that same place. There is no room for anything to go wrong, and Rodney was kneeling at the edge of all of it, on a wet, slippery dock, with no one beside him. When his footing shifted on the wet surface beneath him, after he fell into the water, the situation changed very quickly. The electrical current and the surrounding water combined to deliver a sudden shock that left Rodney unable to control his body. He went under almost immediately and did not resurface. Unable to swim or push himself up, he remained trapped beneath the surface until he stopped breathing. People nearby quickly noticed something was wrong, and emergency services were called. Rescue teams entered the water and located his body near the dock structure shortly after. He was confirmed deceased at the scene, with drowning recorded as the cause of death and electrical incapacitation noted as a contributing factor. Authorities later issued safety warnings about using non-marine electrical equipment near water and inspected the dock for hazards. It was April 14, 2018, on a two-lane rural road outside Rotorua, New Zealand. However, I want to preface this story by asking, what's the most dangerous thing you've done to feel liked? Whatever it was, it probably wasn't this. Milan Reiko was 38 years old and had taught high school history at a secondary school in Rotorua for 11 years. He had been through a divorce 14 months prior, and by most accounts from colleagues, had not quite found his footing afterward. He had begun posting short-form videos online roughly 8 months before that night. Probably not because he was naturally drawn to it, but because his students responded to it, and their response was something he had likely started to lean on more than he probably realized. But maybe that's just me overanalyzing the incident. The evening had started ordinarily. Milan had attended a regional rugby event and was driving two former students home, both in their early 20s, seated in the rear of his mid-size SUV. Somewhere in the 20-minute drive, the conversation turned to a driving challenge circulating online at the time. The idea was brutally simple and insane. You'd play a song while driving and follow its dance instructions with the SUV. Slide to the left meant a hard swerve. Reverse meant slamming it into reverse on the road. Turn around meant, well, you can guess. It was the kind of thing that reads as obviously dangerous in retrospect, but arrives in the moment wrapped in laughter and low stakes. He mounted his phone to the dashboard vent, confirmed it was recording, and began. The road ahead was straight for the first stretch. The early movements were minor, small, deliberate nudges left and right that drew laughter from the back seat. The song's tempo is deceptive. It starts manageable, and then the cues come faster. Milan kept up with it. That was the problem. The road had been bending gently to the right for roughly a quarter mile when the song called for a hard left movement. The gravel shoulder on that side extended less than 2 feet before the drop-off into the grass verge. The asphalt was dry, but the transition from pavement to shoulder happened fast. One of the rear passengers told investigators later that the mood shifted the moment the wheel went hard, that laughter stopped mid-breath. She said she felt the rear of the vehicle step out before she understood why. Milan corrected. He corrected hard and fast, which is the instinctive response, and it was the wrong one. The SUV began to yaw left into a brief loss of traction, then snapped back as he countersteered too aggressively, sending it into an unstable oscillation rather than a clean recovery. The passenger screamed for him to stop. The truck, a loaded logging rig running the same road in the opposite direction, was approximately 130 feet away when the SUV crossed into its lane. The truck driver later told investigators he saw the headlights come across the line and had no time to do anything meaningful. He braked. That was all he could do. The impact was driver's side, direct at closing speed. The truck driver described a single loud concussive sound, not the extended crumpling you might imagine, just one hard, dense impact. The SUV was deflected, beginning a partial rotation before sliding and coming to an uneven stop partly in the gravel shoulder on the far side of the road. The truck driver placed the call immediately. Rural ambulance response reached the scene in 22 minutes. The coroner's findings indicated Milan sustained massive blunt force trauma to the chest and neck, consistent with a high-speed driver's side collision. His aorta was disrupted. Several ribs were fractured inward. There was severe cervical spine damage. Death was determined to be likely instantaneous, consistent with the severity of catastrophic internal injuries at impact. One rear passenger sustained compound fractures to both lower legs and survived. The other rear passenger was treated for minor lacerations. The school where Milan had worked released a short condolence statement within the week. I can sit here and judge Milan, but I've done my own version of swerving into oncoming traffic just to hear someone in the back seat laugh. The only difference between him and me is that my lane stayed empty. It was January 19, 2017, when 24-year-old Brielle Knox made a decision that would cost her everything. The freelance photographer had moved from sunny California to Duluth, Minnesota just 6 months earlier, drawn by stunning winter landscapes that would set her portfolio apart. Brielle stood 5'5" with flowing blonde hair she often left uncovered, despite brutal Minnesota winters. Her artistic eye was undeniable, but her impulsive nature and tendency to dismiss safety warnings from seasoned outdoor enthusiasts had earned her a reputation among local photography groups. She prioritized the perfect shot over practical precautions, often choosing fashion over function. That frigid morning, temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Local authorities had issued warnings about unpredictable ice conditions following a recent warm spell, but Brielle dismissed these concerns as overly cautious. She arrived at the popular frozen lake at 6 a.m., determined to capture the sunrise for her growing Instagram following. Carrying 20 pounds of camera equipment in her backpack, Brielle wore fashionable boots instead of proper winter gear. Local ice fishermen approached her near the shore, explaining that ice thickness measured only 3 to 4 inches in many areas, well below the 6-inch minimum recommended for safe walking. She brushed off their warnings with a confident smile. At 6:45 a.m., Brielle ventured approximately 100 yards from shore, chasing the perfect angle of sunrise reflecting off the ice surface. Occasional cracking sounds echoed beneath her feet, but she pressed forward, focused entirely on her artistic vision. Setting up her tripod for a long exposure shot, she heard a loud crack and felt the ice shift beneath her weight. Instead of retreating to safety, Brielle attempted to quickly capture her planned photographs. As she moved to a different position, her weight caused a 6-foot diameter section of thin ice to give way completely. She plunged into the 34-degree water below, her heavy camera equipment immediately dragging her downward. The shock of frigid water triggered an involuntary gasp response, causing Brielle to inhale water as she struggled beneath the surface. Her waterlogged winter clothing became impossibly heavy, while her expensive camera gear continued pulling her deeper. She fought desperately to reach the surface and grab the ice edge, but the thin ice continued breaking away under her weight. Within 2 minutes, the extreme cold water caused rapid loss of muscle control and coordination. Brielle could no longer swim effectively or climb out, her movements becoming increasingly sluggish. Her camera equipment, once her pride and joy, now served as an anchor, dragging her toward the lake bottom. After approximately 4 minutes in the water, hypothermia and drowning claimed Brielle's consciousness. Her body sank beneath the ice sheet, where underwater currents carried her away from the original breakpoint, making rescue efforts exponentially more difficult. Ice fishermen who heard her initial cries for help immediately called 911, but rescue divers faced challenging conditions searching beneath the unstable ice. They didn't recover Brielle's body until 6 hours later, approximately 200 yards from where she had fallen through. The coroner determined the cause of death as drowning complicated by severe hypothermia. Brielle's core body temperature had dropped to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Her camera equipment, still strapped to her body, had prevented any chance of survival. The tragic incident prompted Duluth city officials to install additional warning signs about dangerous ice conditions and establish a real-time ice thickness monitoring system. Brielle's death served as a stark reminder that nature's beauty often conceals deadly dangers, and no photograph is worth risking human life. It was December 15, 2018, when the incident occurred at a renovated townhouse in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. The 3-story building had been recently remodeled with a focus on modern minimalist design. The evening temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with light snow falling intermittently. Inside, ambient lighting from recessed fixtures and candles created dim visibility in certain areas. The staircase connecting the 2nd and 3rd floors had been custom-built as part of the renovation. It consisted of 13 steps made from polished oak hardwood. Each step measured approximately 9 inches in depth, well below standard residential code. The designer had intentionally omitted handrails on both sides to maintain a clean visual aesthetic. The polished surface had no traction strips. Maya Brooks, 29 years old, worked in social investment, managing online campaigns for lifestyle brands. Her job required constant content creation and a curated public image. She was known among friends as image-obsessed and often careless about practical safety, in favor of visual appeal. That evening, she had been invited to a holiday gathering at the townhouse. Approximately 20 guests were present. The host had mentioned that the staircase was primarily decorative and that guests should use the main staircase near the front entrance. Despite this, several guests used the decorative staircase throughout the night. Maya had ascended and descended the staircase at least 4 times during the evening, often pausing to take photos or record videos. She was wearing black heels with smooth leather soles. Shortly after 9 p.m., she climbed to the 3rd floor to film a video. She held her phone in her right hand, angled toward herself. She began descending while still recording, her attention divided between the screen and the steps. Her right foot landed on the 2nd step from the top. The smooth sole of her heel made contact with the polished wood at a slight angle. Her foot slipped forward. She lost her balance immediately. She extended her left arm instinctively, but failed to find a handrail within reach. She fell headfirst down the staircase. Her forehead struck the edge of the 4th step with significant force. The impact fractured her skull above the right eye. Her neck compressed violently as her head absorbed the momentum. The 2nd and 3rd cervical vertebrae fractured at the base of the skull. The medical examiner later determined that the spinal cord sustained catastrophic injury at the upper cervical level. Her body continued tumbling downward. She struck several more steps before coming to rest at the base of the 2nd floor landing. She lay motionless on her side. Her phone had fallen separately and landed several feet away. 2 guests on the 2nd floor heard the impacts and found Maya unresponsive. 1 guest checked for breathing. None was detected. Another guest called emergency services at 9:14 p.m. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. No effective respiration was detected, and no palpable pulse could be confirmed. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The staircase was photographed by responding officers. The host confirmed that guests had been advised against using the staircase. Several attendees corroborated that Maya had used it multiple times throughout the evening. An autopsy identified the cause of death as a traumatic cervical spine fracture with spinal cord transection. The medical examiner noted that the injury caused immediate cessation of respiratory function. The official report concluded that the combination of narrow step depth, lack of handrails, polished surface, and inappropriate footwear created conditions that led to the fall. The report noted that the victim's attention was diverted by the phone. It was March 18, 2017, in an abandoned industrial warehouse in suburban Ohio, where overcast skies and 42-degree temperatures hung over a vast concrete interior marked by oil stains and decades of neglect. Arlo Vance, 34, worked in commercial videography and had rented the warehouse space through a short-term location rental platform, commonly used by videographers for what he described as a creative proposal shoot. Known for ambitious projects and a willingness to push beyond standard setups, Arlo believed striking visuals were what set his work apart. He spent the morning arranging equipment throughout the cavernous interior, confident his professional experience allowed him to manage the risks involved. His girlfriend of 4 years waited near the entrance, believing she was assisting with a routine client project, while a fixed camera on a heavy tripod recorded from approximately 40 feet away. The centerpiece of Arlo's setup was a rented scissor lift positioned in the warehouse's center. The hydraulic platform stood extended to roughly 25 feet, providing an elevated stage against the industrial backdrop. Earlier that day, Arlo had removed the standard guardrails to accommodate lighting equipment and achieve unobstructed camera angles, leaving him exposed while reaching outward from the elevated platform. Unknown to him, temporary power had been restored to portions of the warehouse to support lighting and filming equipment, energizing an outdated electrical system that had deteriorated significantly over the years of abandonment. As the afternoon progressed, Arlo ascended the lift using the platform controls. The platform rose smoothly to its predetermined height, where he had arranged props and positioning markers. He positioned several battery-powered LED lights around the platform's perimeter, creating the atmospheric lighting he envisioned for the proposal. The tripod camera captured Arlo moving into position on the platform. He began lowering himself to one knee, positioning himself for the proposal he had planned, with a small ring box later visible on the platform in the recorded footage. As he reached past the LED light panel toward a nearby support beam to make a final adjustment, his hand made contact with exposed wiring from a corroded metal conduit, feeding a faulty junction box mounted on the beam. wiring he hadn't noticed during setup due to its position behind the lighting equipment. Standing on the metal scissor lift platform, his body provided a direct path to ground. The electrical shock was immediate and severe. Investigators later determined the circuit lacked effective grounding and modern protective cutoffs, allowing the current to pass through his body without interruption. The camera recorded him convulsing from the shock before collapsing motionless on the platform, the electrical contact having caused cardiac arrest. His girlfriend, seeing him suddenly collapse on the elevated platform, immediately contacted emergency services while trying to understand what had happened from her position below. The warehouse's remote location required additional time for responders to locate the building and gain access. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 15 minutes, but Arlo could not be resuscitated. The medical examiner determined death was caused by electrocution leading to cardiac arrest. The investigation revealed that the warehouse's electrical system had never been updated to modern safety codes and contained numerous code violations, including exposed wiring and absent ground fault protection. The building's owner had failed to disclose these hazardous conditions when renting the space. Investigators found scorch marks on the junction box wiring and evidence of electrical contact on Arlo's hand. The footage was analyzed by workplace safety investigators and electrical safety experts. Authorities ruled the death accidental, but cited the building owner's negligence in maintaining safe electrical systems and Arlo's unawareness of industrial electrical hazards as contributing factors. The case prompted renewed scrutiny of abandoned industrial spaces being offered for short-term rental. It was June 14, 2017, behind a strip of unused farmland in Madhubani district, Bihar, India, where a concrete latrine pit had been sitting in slow deterioration for longer than most adults in the area could clearly remember. The monsoon had softened the ground to mud. The flies were already thick by mid-morning. Sanjeev Batra was 17, and people said that he was the loudest presence in any space he entered. Sanjeev occupied himself the way boys his age did when adult life hadn't claimed them yet, circling other boys, testing edges, making himself the center of whatever was happening. Neighbors had complained to his parents enough times that both had stopped fully engaging with the complaints. He had a particular habit of targeting quieter boys with low-grade public humiliation until they either pushed back or walked away. The dare emerged the way most dares do among teenage boys, sideways, almost as a joke, someone reading the social temperature before committing to it. Sanjeev had spent most of the afternoon mocking a friend, pushing past the point where the friend could absorb it quietly. Someone said the obvious thing, and the septic pit was 30 feet away. The monsoon had been working on the pit for weeks. The surface crust had softened considerably. Sanjeev climbed onto the concrete rim with several boys watching. He slipped off his sandals, the deliberateness of it, the performance of being unbothered, and jumped into the feces waste. He sank immediately to mid-thigh depth into unstable, semi-liquid waste and rain-diluted sludge, accumulated over what investigators later estimated at several years of unmanaged use. There was no solid footing beneath him, only collapsing pockets of softened material that shifted under his weight. Witnesses above described a wet, heavy impact sound followed by his voice, cursing, then demanding a rope. The laughter from the rim was immediate and loud enough that the boys filming could barely hold their phones steady, though it began to fade as his struggle became visible and less controlled. What none of them saw until he was already out was the wound, a section of rusted metal, part of a broken structural bracket from the pit's original concrete construction, had driven into his lower left calf when he landed. A second foot had scraped hard against fractured concrete along the pit wall. He pulled himself out using the bucket rope, covered entirely in waste material, and vomited several times on the ground while the boys around him were still laughing. For 2 days, he treated it the way he treated most things, by refusing to acknowledge it was serious. The cuts on his shins were already there from farm work. This registered as more of the same. By the 3rd day, the tissue around the puncture had swollen visibly, reddening outward in a pattern extending several inches from the entry point. His parents attributed the fever and vomiting to food poisoning and did not examine the wound closely because he always had wounds, and they always turned out fine. On the 5th day, he collapsed near the family courtyard. His uncle transported him by motorcycle to the nearest rural clinic. By that point, the infection had progressed well beyond what the clinic's available resources could address. He died the following morning. Clinical documentation listed the cause of death as septicemia, secondary to an infected puncture wound with significantly delayed presentation, meaning the bacteria from the waste material had entered through the open cuts, spread through his bloodstream over 5 days, and shut his organs down before anyone had treated it as an emergency. His death became the kind of story parents in nearby villages repeated when boys started daring each other toward something dangerous. Not as a tribute, just as a warning delivered in passing. I think that's probably the saddest version of being remembered that there is. It was the 13th of June, 2015, Clearwater Junction, Ohio. The night air was cool and sharp as 2 men worked under the pale yellow glow of a storage yard's overhead lighting, unloading gear from a pickup truck after a long weekend at a regional reptile expo. Evan Kessler was 35 years old, stocky and broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who filled a room without trying and who had spent most of his adult life working warehouse logistics across a string of distribution centers in central Ohio, hauling freight, managing loading bays, and generally doing the kind of physical work that made him feel capable and in control of most situations he walked into. He had grown up in Clearwater Junction, never moved far, and still spent most of his weekends around a handful of exotic animal collectors, which was how he had ended up friends with Mark in the first place. His friend Mark ran a licensed exotic reptile handling business, traveling across Midwest expos under permit, and his collection included several venomous species transported inside professional double-latched crates specifically designed for that purpose. Double-latched, professionally designed. I have seen enough of these stories to know that when someone goes out of their way to build a crate that says "do not touch this," they mean it. One of the crates held a juvenile cobra, secured and padded in the truck bed alongside other equipment. The plan for the evening was simple: unload everything into the storage yard and go home. Evan was there to help carry the non-hazardous gear. When he reached into the truck bed, he found an equipment bag wedged beneath the cobra's crate, and rather than waiting for Mark, he decided to lift the crate slightly to free it. Mark told him sharply to put it down, that the crate held a venomous cobra and needed to be handled only by him under controlled conditions. Evan set the crate down, but kept one hand on the lid to steady it. As he shifted his grip, the top panel flexed slightly, opening a small gap along the front edge where the latch had not fully engaged. The cobra struck upward through that gap and caught Evan across the fingers before he pulled his hand back. Mark told him immediately that they needed to go to a hospital. Evan looked at his hand, flexed his fingers, and said it was fine. He was standing, thinking clearly, and nothing felt seriously wrong. So instead of the hospital, the two ended up at a nearby diner. What Evan did not know was that neurotoxic venom can be deceptively quiet in its early stages, working silently at a neurological level long before the body makes it obvious. Inside the diner, Evan ordered food, showed the bite marks to a couple of truck drivers at the counter, and laughed it off. But within 30 minutes, his eyelids had grown heavy and his words were coming out slower and thicker than normal. Small enough changes that he dismissed them. I find this part the hardest to sit with, not because of what the venom was doing, but because every person in that diner, Evan included, had a window to act and none of them walked through it. Mark did not dismiss them, and told Evan plainly that the venom was beginning to affect his nervous system and that they needed to leave immediately. Evan said he just needed another few minutes. He did not improve. His coordination deteriorated, his breathing slowed, and when he tried to stand, he could not do it steadily. Diner staff recognized something was seriously wrong and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and began respiratory support, but the venom had been working untreated for close to 2 hours by then. Evan could not be stabilized and was pronounced dead that night. Clinicians later noted that the time spent at the diner had pushed him past the point where treatment could have saved him. He believed the snake needed to look dangerous before it could actually be dangerous, and that belief cost him the only time that ever mattered. It was June 8, 2019, on a stretch of unfinished bypass road on the outskirts of Pune, India. A scooter would come down that road in a few minutes, and by the time the dust settled, 2 men's lives would be changed. Raghav Bhosle was 32 years old and worked as a repair technician for industrial sewing machines. He rented a one-room apartment above a pharmacy on a narrow lane. He had no close social circle to speak of. People said that on most evenings he spent outside neighborhood tea stalls, drinking chai and watching the street. street. 3 months before this morning, he had purchased a used motor scooter. By June, he had begun filming himself on it for TikTok. The TikTok trend he was replicating was where riders stood upright on moving scooters, arms out, one hand raised, coasting like they were born on 2 wheels. What the videos didn't show, and what Raghav had no way of fully appreciating, was the years of muscle memory behind those 30-second clips. If you've been riding for fewer than 4 months, just like Raghav, I bet you also couldn't replicate that. His daily experience was limited to commuting through stop-and-go city traffic, low speed, constant correction, full attention on the handlebars. Standing on a moving scooter at highway speed is a different mechanical problem entirely, and he had no supervised instruction, no gradual progression, and no protective gear beyond what he chose not to wear that morning. He likely chose the bypass specifically because it was empty. That part at least made sense. Away from the city, no pedestrians, no intersections. He mounted his phone to the handlebars using a clip-style holder, started the recording, and accelerated. A small cargo truck loaded with textile goods was traveling the same road roughly well over 150 feet behind him. The truck driver, Suresh Patil, 44, later told investigators the scooter had been moving normally when he first noticed it. Straight, steady, unremarkable. There was nothing to suggest what was about to happen. The bypass road itself is flat and featureless, low scrub on either side, cracked earth, the distant sound of highway traffic somewhere beyond a tree line. At roughly 40 miles per hour, the air would have been loud. The scooter's engine, a modest 110 cubic centimeters, pitched high under acceleration. No shade, no witnesses except the truck behind him, and a fixed security camera mounted at a toll collection booth approximately 200 yards down the road. The footage from that camera captured what happened in the middle distance. Raghav rose from the seat. The scooter's front end began a slow lateral oscillation, the kind of wobble that begins small and compounds with each half-second that passes without correction. The truck driver, Suresh, later told investigators he saw the rider stand and felt an immediate drop in his stomach. He began braking at that moment, but the wobble quickly collapsed. The scooter's front wheel kicked left. Raghav's weight, no longer centered over the seat, had nowhere to transfer. He went forward, chest into the handlebar assembly, and then over it. Suresh said he felt something under through the floor of his cab before he could fully stop. The scooter spun riderless into the shoulder. Debris, the phone mount, a sandal, part of the front fairing, scattered across a 30-foot section of road. The toll camera showed the truck come to a stop, the driver's door open, and the man exit at a run. Suresh called for emergency services immediately from the roadside. A highway medical team pronounced Raghav dead at the scene. The coroner's findings, in plain terms, was a massive head trauma from initial road contact, consistent with a forward ejection at speed without helmet protection. Additional injuries to the chest cavity and abdomen were consistent with partial vehicle compression. Raghav's family had his social media accounts deleted within days of the funeral. There was no public statement. I have known people like Raghav, quiet people who found something that made them feel seen and chased it without anyone around to tell them to slow down. That's not a character flaw. That's just being human in the wrong moment. What stays with me isn't the footage or the report. It's the tea stalls, the evenings outside watching the street, the scooter he was probably proud of. None of that deserved to end on an empty road on a Sunday morning, and I genuinely wish it hadn't. It was July 15, 2017, when 23-year-old Griffin McRae made the fatal decision that would end his promising career as a freelance photographer and social media influencer. Griffin stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with an athletic build that matched his reckless confidence. Working from his cramped studio apartment in Billings, Montana, he had spent 2 years building his Instagram following to 5,000 devoted fans who eagerly awaited his next death-defying photograph. His dismissive attitude toward safety warnings had become legendary among his peers, often bragged about shots others deemed impossible. For weeks, Griffin had obsessed over an abandoned radio tower he discovered through urban exploration forums. The 200-foot structure sat isolated in rural Montana, its rusted frame promising the viral content he desperately needed to boost his stagnating engagement rates. Multiple forum users warned about structural instability, but Griffin dismissed their concerns with characteristic arrogance. His girlfriend, Brielle Knox, pleaded with him the night before, her voice trembling as she begged him to reconsider. Griffin simply laughed, telling her he had done this 100 times before while already planning his Instagram story approach. At 5:30 that morning, Griffin arrived at the remote location carrying his professional camera equipment. Wearing only sneakers, jeans, and a tank top, he completely ignored the multiple danger, unstable structure signs posted around the tower's base. His live stream began immediately, showing his followers the imposing structure against the dawn sky. The ascent started at 6:15. Griffin climbed the rusted ladder rungs methodically, pausing every 20 feet to capture selfies and update his social media. His followers watched in real time as he documented each stage of the dangerous climb, their comments mixing admiration with growing concern. At 150 feet, Griffin reached a platform where he set up his tripod. The sunrise backdrop was perfect, exactly what he had envisioned for weeks. Completely absorbed in capturing the ultimate shot, he began experimenting with increasingly dramatic poses, leaning further over the platform's edge with each attempt. The morning dew had accumulated silently on the metal surfaces, creating an invisible death trap. As Griffin attempted his most ambitious hanging pose, his sneaker lost traction on the slick platform. His desperate grab for the railing failed catastrophically when the corroded metal support gave way under his weight. The fall lasted 4.2 seconds. Griffin plummeted 150 feet, his body striking multiple crossbeams and support cables during the descent. The impacts caused severe blunt force trauma to his head, chest, and limbs before he crashed into the rocky ground below. His camera continued recording throughout the entire fatal descent until it shattered upon impact. Emergency responders discovered Griffin's body at 8:45 when Brielle called 911 after he failed to respond to her increasingly frantic messages. They found him with his phone still clutched in his hand, displaying an unsent Instagram post that would never reach his followers. The coroner's report detailed the extensive damage: fractured skull, severed spinal cord, punctured lungs, and massive internal bleeding. Griffin's final Instagram story had posted automatically before his fall, showing his confident smile against the Montana sky, unaware that death waited just moments away. 3 months later, the county demolished the abandoned radio tower, with Griffin's death serving as the catalyst for stricter enforcement of trespassing laws at dangerous abandoned structures. His Instagram account remains active, a digital memorial to the ultimate price of viral fame, forever frozen at 5,000 followers who never got to see his final, fatal shot. It was May 19, 2018, when the incident occurred at a hillside estate in the northern outskirts of Scottsdale, Arizona. The property sat on approximately 2 acres of sloped desert terrain with panoramic views of the surrounding valley. The estate featured a custom infinity pool built into the hillside, with a shallow tanning ledge along one side measuring 9 inches deep. The ledge extended roughly 8 feet in width and was designed for lounging. The deeper section of the pool reached a maximum depth of 5 feet. Ivy Gable, 34 years old, worked in the wellness industry as a patron and consultant for boutique fitness studios. Her role involved promoting lifestyle brands and hosting events for clients. She was known to be overconfident in social settings and dismissive of advice she considered overly cautious. That afternoon, she had invited a group of acquaintances to her home for a poolside gathering. Alcohol had been served steadily since early afternoon. By mid-afternoon, several guests were visibly intoxicated. Throughout the day, multiple people had commented on the shallow depth of the tanning ledge. One guest mentioned that it was not suitable for diving. Another pointed out the warning decal on the pool deck, which clearly indicated no diving. Ivy dismissed the concerns, insisting that she had used the pool countless times and knew its layout. She spent much of the afternoon moving between the ledge and the deeper section without issue. Shortly after 4 p.m., she climbed out of the pool and stood on the concrete edge adjacent to the tanning ledge. She announced her intention to dive back in. 2 guests verbally objected. One stepped toward her. She ignored them and positioned herself with her toes gripping the edge. She bent forward, extended her arms above her head, and pushed off with her legs. Her body arced forward and downward. The angle of entry was steep, aimed directly at the shallow ledge. Her hands entered the water first, followed immediately by her head. The crown of her skull struck the textured concrete bottom within a fraction of a second. The impact was direct and forceful. Her neck compressed violently as her momentum drove her head into the surface. The 5th and 6th cervical vertebrae fractured at the base of the skull. The medical examiner later determined that the injury resulted in a complete cervical spinal cord transection. Her body went limp. She remained face down in the water, arms floating loosely at her sides. Several guests noticed within seconds and began shouting. 2 people entered the pool and pulled her toward the edge. They lifted her onto the deck and turned her onto her back. Her eyes were open but unresponsive. No normal breathing was detected. One guest hesitated, then attempted chest compressions while another called emergency services at 4:12 p.m. Paramedics arrived approximately 11 minutes later. They found no pulse and no respiratory effort. Advanced life support measures were initiated. After sustained advanced life support efforts with no return of spontaneous circulation, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The pool area was secured and photographed by responding officers. An autopsy identified the cause of death as catastrophic cervical spine trauma, with associated spinal cord injury sustained during the dive. The medical examiner noted that the spinal injury caused immediate paralysis below the neck, eliminating any meaningful ability to move or protect her airway. Toxicology results indicated a blood alcohol concentration of 0.14%. The official report concluded that Ivy Gable died from diving into water insufficient in depth, compounded by alcohol consumption that impaired judgment. It was July 3, 2015, at Lake Havasu's public boat ramp. Clear evening skies and holiday crowds filled the launch area, where weekend boaters and families gathered along the shoreline ahead of planned fireworks. Nicolette Banks, 31, worked in event coordination and had spent weeks planning what she hoped would be a once-in-a-lifetime lakeside proposal. Accustomed to managing weddings and large public events, she'd grown confident in her ability to orchestrate complex moments under pressure. Friends described her as meticulous but drawn to spectacle, convinced that memorable experiences required bold visual impact. In the months leading up to the trip, she spoke openly about wanting the proposal to feel unmistakably big, something her boyfriend would never forget. Rather than hiring professionals, Nicolette chose to handle the fireworks herself, purchasing an assortment of consumer-grade aerial shells from a roadside stand. She believed smaller fireworks would be safer, while still delivering the dramatic effect she envisioned. Her boyfriend of 3 years waited nearby, unaware of her plan, while a close friend positioned herself roughly 30 feet away with a smartphone to document the surprise. The setup depended on precise timing and placement, leaving little margin for error. The public boat ramp's concrete surface showed typical wear from constant trailer traffic, with uneven sections and lingering moisture from lake splash. Nicolette arranged 4 medium-sized fireworks inside empty 5-gallon plastic buckets instead of proper stabilizing racks, placing them in a loose line about 6 feet from where she planned to kneel. She had seen similar setups used casually at backyard celebrations and assumed the buckets would be sufficient. Resting directly on wet concrete, the plastic bucket sat on a low-friction surface, offering almost no resistance to recoil, an overlooked detail that would prove critical once the fireworks ignited. As the sun approached the horizon, Nicolette moved into position near the makeshift setup. Her friend began recording as Nicolette approached the first firework, positioning herself within arm's reach of the bucket to coordinate the ignition with the planned proposal. The smartphone footage captured Nicolette lighting the fuse while facing toward the camera and her boyfriend's location. The ignition appeared successful, with the fuse burning normally for approximately 2 seconds. However, the lightweight plastic bucket immediately began shifting as the fireworks' internal pressure built toward launch. The shell's initial thrust caused the entire firework to tip sideways within the unstable bucket. Instead of launching vertically as designed, the projectile discharged horizontally across the dock surface at close range. The shell traveled less than 15 feet at a shallow upward angle roughly level with her upper body before impact. The impact occurred at close range, with the projectile's timed burst charge igniting moments after impact. The blast force and fragmentation caused catastrophic injuries, leading to rapid collapse. The smartphone recording captured the flash and smoke, followed by confused reactions from nearby bystanders who initially assumed the explosion was part of the planned display. Several witnesses approached but quickly backed away upon recognizing the severity of the injuries. The friend continued recording for several more seconds before stopping the video and calling emergency services. Other boaters in the immediate area began clearing the ramp to allow access for responders. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 8 minutes, but pronounced Nicolette deceased at the scene. The investigation revealed that the aerial fireworks used were later determined to be restricted consumer fireworks under local regulations, and that proper stabilization and safe distance protocols had not been followed. The plastic buckets provided insufficient weight and stability for the shell's launch force. The smartphone footage was reviewed by authorities during the investigation and became key evidence in the accidental death ruling, documenting the improper fireworks handling that resulted in Nicolette's death. It was December 31st, 2015, on the eastern fringe of Cotabato City, Philippines, where the last hours of the year dissolved into firecracker smoke and the sound of children running in the alleys. Nobody on that street was paying close attention to anything that night, which is exactly the condition that tends to precede certain kinds of disasters. Ramil Jandayan was 32 years old and lived in the margins of other people's lives. Based on my research, there's really not much known about him and his family. However, neighbors described him as paranoid and unstable, quick to threaten people over imagined disrespect. A police report said that in the months before his death, he had been running errands for a low-level militant cell operating near the city. Apparently, he had been assigned to stay overnight in a rented safe house on the city's edge, minding a homemade explosive device he made scheduled for transport the following morning. Investigations suggested that the job was not his to manage beyond keeping it secure, and he was originally only meant to act as a basic overnight guard, while more experienced members handled the device. But after others left the location to move between sites during New Year's activity, he remained inside the structure. Against instructions, he later interfered with the assembly and wired a cheap prepaid cell phone into a crude triggering system, built around a simple improvised relay switch scavenged from low-voltage electronics rather than any stable firing unit. I think the people who gave him this assignment already knew exactly who they were dealing with. He must have kept the phone powered on beside the device. That day, the fireworks outside were constant, random detonations across the district, some close enough to rattle the shutters, the kind of noise that hides everything underneath it. And then the telecom provider's automated promotional message went out as part of a congested New Year's network-wide holiday broadcast. It reached his phone shortly after midnight. The incoming signal triggered the phone's vibration motor, which in turn activated the improvised relay circuit. Aljun Marohom, one of the militants arrested weeks later, said that he was sitting in a plastic chair in the unit next door, near the shared wall, when the flash came through. He later told investigators it wasn't fire exactly, just light and pressure arriving at the same instant, lifting him from the chair and depositing him on the floor. His windows blew outward into the alley in a single burst. The roof panels above him rose and dropped back down with a heavy, hollow metallic sound. He remained on the floor for several seconds before he understood what had happened. His ears rang for the rest of the night. Police and firefighters arrived roughly 10 to 15 minutes later, initially responding as though a fireworks stockpile had detonated. Ramil's body parts were found in the room's interior. Investigators recovered fragments of the shattered cell phone scattered across debris near the wall and embedded shallowly in broken plaster and wood fragments. The initial post-incident assessment described catastrophic blast trauma, severe fragmentation injuries to the torso and upper body, complete disruption of the chest cavity, consistent with a point-blank detonation. The more formal coroner documentation came later and clarified the extent of internal damage after examination. A brief police statement was released that night in general terms, with more technical conclusions added in subsequent reporting. Aljun was arrested several weeks later, reportedly describing the triggering setup in detail during questioning, and that account became the clearest available reconstruction of what happened inside that room. I don't feel sympathy for Ramil Jandayan, but I do think about whoever handed him that device and left the building. The neighborhood remembered it less as a terrorism incident than as the story of the man who killed himself with a holiday text promotion. It was on the 3rd of May, 2014. A dry basin land stretched for miles outside the isolated mining community in Nevada, bordered by abandoned prospecting routes, collapsed sheds, and remnants of old mineral exploration sites that nobody had touched in decades. Dale Rawlings was 61 years old, a cattle rancher who had worked that land most of his life, and the people living in the community knew him as a man who handled his own problems and trusted almost nobody else to do it for him. I have met men like Dale, not personally but through stories like this one, men who have handled enough hard things in their lives that the idea of asking for help starts to feel like a kind of failure. It is an admirable quality, right up until it is not. While clearing debris from a partially collapsed shed near the edge of his property, Dale pulled back a tarp covering a pile of rusted scrap and found several old wooden crates underneath. Inside were deteriorating commercial blasting materials, explosive sticks, corroded detonator caps, and brittle coils of blasting fuse, all left behind from mining operations that had ended long ago. The wrapping on the explosives showed dark, oily staining and crystal-like residue along the seams, both recognized signs that the materials had broken down chemically and become dangerously unstable. And Dale understood immediately that what he was looking at was serious. That evening, Dale called a longtime friend and described what he had found. His friend urged him clearly and repeatedly to contact the authorities and leave everything exactly where it was. Dale refused, arguing the explosives were on his land, that involving authorities would cause legal and financial problems he did not want, and that he had already worked out a safe way to destroy the material himself. The following afternoon, he loaded the deteriorating explosives into the bucket of an old farm tractor and drove out to an isolated wash bordered by volcanic rock and desert brush, dumping everything into a shallow depression, believing the surrounding terrain would absorb the blast. He then climbed to a firing position roughly 50 to 60 yards away and prepared to detonate the explosives with a scoped hunting rifle. What Dale had not accounted for was how an explosion tears through everything around it, sending rock, metal, and fragments outward at enormous speed in directions impossible to predict. A fragment traveled back up toward the ridgeline and struck him in the upper neck, causing catastrophic injury and rapid blood loss. He collapsed near the firing position and lay there alone for hours, 50 to 60 yards. I looked that up once just to picture it. It is not a small distance on flat open ground. But an explosion does not care about flat open ground, and it does not negotiate with the terrain around it. Dale had thought about distance. He had not thought about physics. The ranch was isolated, and Dale had been working alone. Hours later, a neighboring property owner noticed his tractor still idling near the wash after dark, drove over to investigate, and found Dale severely injured on the hillside. Dale Rawlings was airlifted to hospital, but did not survive. Bomb disposal teams later recovered additional deteriorating blasting material still inside the shed and carried out controlled disposal operations across the property, doing exactly what Dale had been urged to do from the very beginning. The explosives had stayed buried and undisturbed in that Nevada desert for decades, and they only became lethal after someone decided that confidence was a substitute for expertise. It was August 14th, 2019, on a side street branching off a congested arterial road in Quezon City, Philippines. There was no weather event, no mechanical failure, no moment of inattention from anyone who mattered. 3 boys had already conducted similar TikTok trends on this same corridor, multiple times, without consequence. That pattern, not the accident itself, is the real doom of this story. Samuel Ladrillo was 41 years old and worked double shifts as a food delivery rider for a third-party logistics platform, covering routes across the Eastern Metro corridor 6 days a week. His wife had died several years earlier, and he was raising 2 daughters on his own. He had been riding the same motorcycle for 3 years without a major incident. Our featured TikToker is Nico Valdera, who was 17, a school dropout who spent most afternoons at an internet cafe near the Market District. He had organized the group's running TikTok challenge for most of that summer, which was an ambush-style filming where TikTokers would fire gel bead rounds at strangers and record the reactions. The guns were commercially available toys, designed in bright, translucent colors. However, the boys had spray-painted the housings and barrels flat black to make them read as more threatening on camera. I believe that detail is not incidental. They understood on some level exactly what a black-painted firearm-shaped object would communicate to a stranger at dusk. That wasn't an accident of poor judgment. That was the product. The 3 positioned themselves behind a parked delivery van near a curb curb where northbound traffic slowed for a pedestrian crossing. Samuel had stopped briefly, consistent with his documented route, near the intersection. The light above was amber. Traffic around him was dense but moving. He had no line of sight behind the van. The neighborhood at that hour had the particular texture of early evening in a mixed-use corridor. None of it suggested what was already in motion 15 feet behind a parked vehicle. The boys fired multiple gel rounds from behind the van as Samuel's motorcycle idled near the curb. Witnesses standing at a nearby food stall described seeing him duck sharply over the handlebars before gunning the throttle. He accelerated several feet, then braked hard. The rear wheel stepped out. The motorcycle skidded sideways across the road surface and Samuel came off the bike, landing on his right side on the asphalt. He got up. That part is important. He got up, looked back toward where the shots had come from, abandoned the motorcycle entirely after what seemed like a brief hesitation, consistent with believing the rounds were continuing or escalating in intensity, and ran. I don't know how anyone could have done differently. Dashcam footage recovered from a vehicle stopped at the crossing captured what followed. Samuel crossed the curb lane at a full sprint, looking over his left shoulder as he entered the second lane. He was not watching what was in front of him. A sedan traveling approximately 30 to 35 miles per hour in the adjacent through lane struck him broadside. The impact was not instantaneous in the footage. His body traveled across the hood, and his head contacted the road surface as he came off the far side. One shoe remained at the point of impact. His delivery bag burst on the pavement and scattered its contents across the width of the road. A bystander at the food stall called emergency services. Responders arrived approximately 22 minutes later. Samuel was pronounced dead before even reaching the hospital due to a severe skull fracture. Nico and the other two boys fled, but were identified within 48 hours through surveillance footage from multiple cameras along the corridor. All three minors were taken into custody and processed through the juvenile justice system. The sedan driver was cleared, while Samuel's relatives later filed civil liability claims against the boys' families, and the results weren't publicized. Samuel's daughters were school-aged at the time of his death. He had no life insurance. Imagine this. He had already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person when he lost his wife, rebuilt something functional out of what remained, and was in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday shift when three teenagers decided his fear was TikTok content. It was September 22nd, 2016, when 21-year-old Zane Hollowell made a decision that would cost him everything. The ambitious barista from Portland, Oregon had spent 3 years perfecting his parkour skills, transforming from a coffee shop employee into a local free-running sensation with 12,000 YouTube subscribers hungry for increasingly dangerous content. Zane stood 5 feet 10 inches, with the lean, muscular build of someone who treated every urban obstacle as a personal challenge. His competitive nature often pushed him beyond reasonable limits, especially when his girlfriend watched from the sidelines or when his fellow traceurs questioned his commitment. Working morning shifts at a trendy downtown coffee shop gave him afternoons to train, but it was the evening sessions that truly tested his abilities. The downtown office building complex had caught his attention weeks earlier during a daylight scouting mission. The connected structures created a perfect playground of varying heights, with gaps ranging from 8 to 15 feet between rooftops. He had mapped every jump, calculated every distance, but had never attempted the sequence after dark. Despite weather reports warning of light rain, Zane arrived at 10 p.m. with his friend Colton Hayes, a fellow traceur who doubled as his cameraman. Colton, more cautious by nature, had expressed concerns about the conditions, but Zane's determination to film content for his growing channel overrode any safety considerations. The session began at 10:45 p.m., with Zane successfully navigating several smaller jumps, while Colton captured multiple angles. His confidence grew with each successful landing, the familiar rush of adrenaline drowning out the sound of light rain beginning to patter against the concrete surfaces. The final jump represented the sequence's climax, a 12-foot gap between buildings with a 3-foot height difference. Zane had visualized this moment countless times, knowing it would become the centerpiece of his next viral video. He positioned himself 30 feet back from the edge, feeling the wet concrete beneath his running shoes as he prepared for his approach. The run-up felt perfect until the critical moment when his left foot encountered a slick patch of rain-soaked concrete. The slip occurred precisely at the building's edge, destroying his carefully calculated trajectory and timing. Instead of the clean, controlled leap he had practiced in his mind, Zane found himself rotating forward mid-air, his body betraying him when precision mattered most. He fell short of the target building by approximately 2 feet, his chest striking the concrete ledge with devastating force. The impact fractured multiple ribs, which immediately punctured both lungs. The collision sent him bouncing backward into a 40-foot fall down the narrow alley between buildings. Colton watched in horror as his friend's body struck the concrete below with a sickening impact that fractured Zane's pelvis and caused severe head trauma. Racing down to the alley, Colton found Zane conscious but unable to speak, blood filling his punctured lungs as he struggled for each breath. The 911 call came immediately, but the damage was too extensive. 25 minutes after the fall, before paramedics could transport him to the hospital, Zane succumbed to massive internal bleeding and respiratory failure. His pursuit of the perfect shot had ended in the most permanent way possible. The entire incident remained captured on Colton's camera, sparking widespread debate about the responsibility of documenting dangerous stunts. Building owners responded by installing additional security measures and anti-climbing barriers, ensuring that Zane's tragic miscalculation would serve as a deterrent for future thrill seekers. His YouTube channel, once a source of pride and growing influence, became a digital memorial to the risks of pushing boundaries without adequate safety measures. The 10,000 subscribers who had encouraged increasingly extreme content were left to grapple with their role in demanding the spectacular footage that ultimately cost Zane his life. It was July 22, 2016, when the incident occurred inside a converted warehouse loft in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, New York. The building had been repurposed from industrial use into private residential and studio spaces over a decade prior. The structure was 5 stories tall, constructed primarily of brick and steel beams. The freight elevator servicing the units was original to the building, installed sometime in the early 1970s. Dante Miller, 47, worked in private art acquisition, sourcing and managing collections for high-net-worth clients, including private collectors and family offices. His work involved handling 6- and 7-figure pieces, coordinating discrete sales, and overseeing storage across multiple secured locations in the city. He used his 4th-floor loft unit to house high-value inventory and conduct private appraisals away from public galleries. That day, he arrived with a companion who assisted him with cataloging and transport. The two had been moving crated items between floors using the freight elevator for most of the afternoon. Earlier in the week, the elevator had stalled twice between floors. Both times it resumed operation after several seconds of delay. Miller had mentioned the issue to building management but had not waited for a repair appointment. On the day of the incident, the elevator stalled again while descending. Rather than wait, Miller manually interfered with the elevator's safety systems by accessing a maintenance panel inside the car. This allowed the elevator to move without the automatic braking system engaged. His companion had exited on the 4th floor and was waiting for him to return. The elevator began its descent from the 4th floor. The car moved unevenly, jerking slightly as it passed the 3rd floor threshold. The guide rails, which kept the car aligned within the shaft, had corroded at their lower mounting brackets. The stress from the uneven movement caused the brackets to snap free. With the safety systems disabled and the car destabilized, it tilted and dropped suddenly. It fell roughly 1.5 stories, approximately 15 to 18 feet, before impacting the concrete floor of the elevator pit. Miller was standing near the center when the car dropped. He was briefly weightless as it fell. When the elevator slammed into the pit floor, the sudden deceleration drove the floor violently upward into his body. The impact compressed the elevator floor inward. Miller was thrown downward, his body absorbing the full deceleration force. His pelvis was fractured in multiple places. Several ribs on his left side were shattered and punctured his spleen and left lung. Internal bleeding began immediately. He exhibited brief agonal breathing and movement before rapidly losing consciousness. His companion heard the crash from the 4th floor and immediately descended the stairwell. Upon reaching the ground level, they found the elevator car wedged partially into the pit, its doors jammed shut. They called emergency services at approximately 3:47 p.m. Firefighters arrived within 9 minutes and used hydraulic tools to pry open the outer doors. Paramedics found Miller unresponsive with no detectable pulse. The elevator was powered down and secured. An inspection revealed that the guide rail brackets had been weakened by water infiltration from a roof leak unrepaired for more than 2 years. The safety interlock had been manually overridden. The report concluded that structural failure and disabled safety mechanisms led to the uncontrolled descent. Dante Miller was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries and internal hemorrhaging caused by blunt force trauma sustained during the fall. It was June 15, 2016, along the Pacific coast near Big Sur. Clear afternoon skies and offshore winds drew tourists to scenic overlooks above a 120-foot drop to jagged rocks below. Reese Calhoun, 27, had driven up from his retail job at an outdoor equipment store in Monterey, where he spent most days selling gear designed for risks he increasingly wanted to take himself. Known among friends for chasing dramatic shots rather than safe ones, Reese had built a modest social media following by positioning himself closer to edges, drops, and unstable terrain than most photographers would attempt. His girlfriend of 2 years joined him, believing it was another routine photo outing, unaware that Reese had been growing frustrated with stagnant engagement numbers and felt pressure to create something memorable enough to stand out. In recent months, he had begun prioritizing visual impact over caution, convinced that a single striking moment could change his trajectory. The couple arrived at a lightly marked coastal overlook around 2:30 p.m., noting the weathered warning signs about unstable shale formations near the cliff edge. Reese unpacked his small drone and smartphone equipment, explaining his plan to capture aerial footage synchronized with ground-level recording. The tide was approaching its lowest point, exposing more of the rocky coastline below and creating the dramatic wave action he wanted as a backdrop. Reese launched the drone approximately 50 feet offshore, positioning it to hover roughly level with the cliff face, making constant micro-adjustments against the coastal wind. His girlfriend began recording on her smartphone as he moved toward the edge, stepping carefully around loose rocks and patches of crumbling shale. The overlook's surface showed clear signs of erosion, with several areas where previous chunks had broken away. Moving backward to frame the shot properly, Reese guided his positioning while keeping his eyes on the drone's camera angle. He lowered himself to one knee, roughly 4 feet from the edge, positioning himself for a proposal. The smartphone footage captured him reaching into his jacket pocket, where a small ring box was later confirmed by investigators. As Reese adjusted his position, his right heel pressed down on a section of fractured shale that extended beneath the surface soil. The geological instability that the warning signs referenced became immediately apparent as a large section of fractured shale beneath the surface sheared away in a cascading failure, taking the surface beneath his feet with it. The drone's aerial perspective captured the collapse near the cliff edge and the immediate aftermath below. He struck an outcropping of rock roughly halfway down before continuing to the boulder field below. The impact with the lower rocks was severe, causing immediate cessation of movement. The drone maintained its position briefly under active stabilization before beginning a slow automated drift as battery power declined, continuing to record until the signal cut out. His girlfriend remained at the overlook and immediately contacted emergency services. The remote location required specialized rope access equipment, delaying the recovery team's arrival until nearly 5 p.m. Responders confirmed death at the scene, citing massive blunt force trauma consistent with the fall distance and rocky terrain. The incident was ruled an accidental death due to a geological hazard. Both the smartphone and drone footage were recovered and analyzed by authorities. The drone's memory card contained the complete sequence, which was later reviewed as part of the investigation, after being downloaded from the controller, documenting the unstable cliff conditions that claimed Reese's life. It was March 17, 2018, in a surface parking lot on the northern edge of Southport Gold Coast, Queensland. Not every death announces itself. Some arrive mid-errand, surrounded by people loading groceries, and the only warning is a sound that witnesses spend weeks trying to describe accurately. Marissa Ryan was 47 and recently divorced. She worked part-time as a styling consultant and had spent the past year rebuilding her public identity with the focus most people reserve for recovery. She drove a restored vintage roadster, an open-top two-seater with exposed rear-wheel hardware and wire spokes, and treated every errand as an occasion. The vehicle was the center of an image she defended aggressively. That Saturday, she arrived in oversized sunglasses, heeled sandals, and a long silk scarf wrapped around her neck, the trailing end nearly at her knees. A store clerk later told investigators she had commented on it herself, said it was meant to look like something from another era. She had spent so long building this version of herself that any concession to practicality would have felt like a public retreat. The decision was entirely consistent with everything she had already committed to. The wind along that section of the lot was running between 12 and 18 miles per hour, enough to keep the storefront banners extended. The lot sat open on three sides with no windbreak. As she moved toward the exit lane at low speed, both ends of the scarf were already active behind her. The rear wheel assembly on that model sits partially exposed below the body panel, a design detail original to the build and preserved in the restoration. Hannah Marquez was walking with her young son, roughly 30 feet from the exit lane. She told investigators the first thing she registered was not visual. It was a short, compressed gagging sound, less than a second long, followed immediately by the scrape of tires against the concrete curb edge. By the time she turned, the car was in the final moments of braking. The scarf had already been drawn into the rotating rear wheel assembly, caught during forward motion before the vehicle reached a stop. As braking force increased, the remaining wheel rotation and vehicle deceleration created a sudden tightening pull. Marissa was pressed hard against the headrest, her neck wrenched sharply to the right. Her sunglasses were on the pavement. The wheel had stopped only after the entanglement fully arrested the remaining rotation. The fabric had not. Several bystanders reached the driver's side within seconds. The scarf could not be loosened by hand. The tension was total. One bystander attempted to reach the fabric near the wheel and could not free it without tools. There was no movement from the driver. I've gone through a lot of accident accounts, and I think what's hardest about this one is how many people were close enough and how little that proximity mattered. Hannah called emergency services from the scene, but paramedics could only pronounce Marissa dead at the scene. The coroner identified the cause of death as mechanical strangulation with acute cervical fracture at the third and fourth vertebrae, occurring during sudden high-tension deceleration, consistent with a rapid lateral traction force applied while the vehicle was braking. There was no survivable interval. The mechanism did exactly what the physics required. The parking attendant was removed from duty pending review and quietly reinstated. I feel for the attendant here more than anything. From my perspective, it's hard to see how one person could realistically anticipate every edge case in a space that complex. And I think they were unfairly left carrying the weight of something that was ultimately a chain of design, behavior, and environment all colliding at once. It was on the 24th of May, 2014. The night air was dry and still in the northern Arizona desert, and out along the empty highway near a partially demolished overpass outside a rural desert town sat dark and silent, its missing center span open to nothing but air, temporary barriers glowing faintly under construction lamps. The site closed and waiting. Wade Parker was 32 years, and his friend Cody McCall was 28, and both of them had grown up loving speed and risk, spending weekends pushing cars across dry washes and rough desert cuts, clearing small gaps and drops on private land, building a confidence between them that had grown slowly and quietly into something dangerous, a belief that momentum could solve almost any problem a road could throw at them. They had seen gap jumps in films, cars flying across broken bridges and crumbling highways, landing clean on the other side, and over time that image had stopped feeling like fantasy and started feeling like something real, something reachable. If you just had enough speed and enough nerve, I understand that feeling, I think. The way a thing you have watched enough times starts to feel possible. What I find harder to understand is the point where possible and certain stopped being different things in their minds. That night, the pair arrived at a partially demolished overpass outside a rural desert town with a wide gap between two elevated spans. The site was closed off with signs, barriers, and a chain gate, though part of the perimeter had been left open earlier that week. Portable floodlights lit the ramp unevenly, leaving the gap in shadow. Wade climbed out and walked to the edge, looking across at the far concrete wall and measuring the gap with his eyes. When he came back, they said what they needed to say, and Cody reversed further down the ramp to give himself a longer run. He accelerated hard, the engine loud in the desert quiet, and at the top, the wheels left the road, and the car was airborne. I keep returning moments like these. Wade walked to the edge, looked across, measured with his eyes. Not instruments, just his eyes in uneven light, over a gap that had been engineered to stop traffic. I wonder what he saw when he looked. For a moment, everything felt exactly as they had imagined, but the arc was too shallow and the distance too great, and the front of the car slammed into the concrete wall just below road level. The impact folded the front end completely before coming to rest at the base of the embankment below. A utility contractor passing on a nearby road spotted the debris and called emergency services. The site was unstable and elevated, and rescue teams had to carefully stabilize the ground around the wreckage before anyone could get close enough to reach the car. Both Wade and Cody died at the scene, taken by the force of an impact that left no margin for survival. Investigators later modeled the trajectory and concluded that the pair had attempted a stunt highly unrealistic, and that the pair had crossed into the site through a section of perimeter fencing that had been left partially open during the week for equipment access. The State Transportation Authority reviewed its construction site safety guidance after the incident, recommending stronger perimeter controls and better lighting at incomplete structures, though changes were applied gradually across different sites rather than all at once. It was September 14, 2018, in a third-floor council flat on the eastern edge of Sheffield, England, where the kind of Saturday afternoon that feels endless and forgettable became the last one a 15-year-old boy would ever have. Darian Kelm was a Year 10 student. He played casual five-a-side football on weekends when enough friends showed up. His parents, both warehouse workers pulling alternating long shifts, kept the flat tidy and the fridge stocked. By most visible measures, Darian was fine. He had a group chat, a decent phone, and the kind of unstructured weekend time that 15-year-olds either fill well or don't. For several weeks that year, the challenge he was about to do had no single name. It moved through TikTok as reposted dares where people would take multiple paracetamol pills. The framing was never dangerous, only edgy. A numbers game, a test of tolerance. Darian had likely seen short clips showing reaction faces and comment sections, but never the consequences. On a Saturday afternoon video call with 3 friends, the conversation mirrored teenage logic, a dare with no real stakes. He mentioned taking handfuls. He stupidly believed nothing would actually happen to him. That belief is the engine of the trend. Over the following 3 to 4 hours, Darian moved through the flat collecting blister packs from the bathroom cabinet, a kitchen drawer, and a shelf in his parents' room. Paracetamol is a drug that exists in nearly every British household in multiples. Headache strips, cold and flu tablets, generic supermarket boxes. He messaged updates to the group chat in a tone that was performative and escalating, increasingly disorganized. His friends replied with a mix of laughing emojis and increasingly uncomfortable pushback. By early evening, his messages noted nausea. He described it as part of the experience. Darian's parents returned home separately in the early hours and found him asleep. Nothing looked wrong. However, by the following morning, he was vomiting. His parents attributed it to something he'd eaten. Now I want to be clear. I don't think they were negligent people. It's just that paracetamol poisoning looks like the flu for the first 24 hours. And no one told them to look for anything else. However, the crazy part is this. His parents left for their Monday shifts after checking on him and making him take another tablet of paracetamol. Over the next 2 days, his condition shifted in ways that a layperson would struggle to interpret as anything other than a worsening stomach bug. He was pale. He stopped eating. He was sleeping longer. By Tuesday evening, the whites of his eyes had taken on a yellow tinge. His friends, reviewing the weekend's messages in full, recognized the volume of tablets he'd described taking and contacted his older cousin. The cousin arrived to the flat on Wednesday morning and found Darian on the bathroom floor, conscious but unresponsive to direct questions, his skin visibly jaundiced and empty blister packs scattered across the tile. Darian was admitted to the intensive care unit of a regional hospital. He died on September 19, 2018, 4 days after admission. The coroner's report, in plain terms, described the cause of death as acute liver failure secondary to paracetamol toxicity, compounded by by hepatic encephalopathy, brain swelling caused by the liver's inability to filter toxins from the blood. I think about how much of this story lives in the gap between two working parents and one unsupervised weekend, not as an indictment, but as a structural failure that nobody named until it was too late. A locked medicine cabinet is a 30-second fix. A conversation about what these TikTok trends actually show is 5 minutes. Neither happened. It was March 14, 2019, when the Pacific Ocean claimed the life of a promising young scientist whose passion for marine life would ultimately lead to her tragic end. Madison Reeve, a 26-year-old marine biology graduate student at UC Santa Barbara, had dedicated her life to understanding the intricate ecosystems that thrived along California's rugged coastline. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with shoulder-length brown hair, Madison possessed an almost obsessive attention to detail that made her research exceptional, but sometimes dangerous. Her professors knew her as the student who would spend hours crouched over tide pools, completely absorbed in her work. On that fateful Thursday afternoon, Madison drove to a remote stretch of Big Sur's rocky coastline, her backseat loaded with research equipment for her thesis on sea anemone populations. Despite warnings from local fishermen about the area's notorious sneaker waves, she felt confident in her coastal fieldwork experience. Her advisor had suggested bringing a research partner, but Madison declined, preferring to work alone. At 2 p.m. during an extremely low tide, Madison positioned herself on a rocky outcrop roughly 50 feet from the high tide line. She methodically arranged her sample containers, waterproof cameras, and measurement tools around her workspace. The tide pools were spectacular that day, teeming with colorful sea anemones. For over 2 hours, Madison worked with laser focus, photographing specimens and recording measurements. She was particularly excited about a cluster of unusually large anemones in a deep pool. The rhythmic sound of waves against rocks became background noise as she lost herself in her research. At 4:30 p.m., crouched low over her specimens, Madison remained oblivious to the rapidly changing conditions. The tide had begun its aggressive return, and a distant storm system was generating increasingly powerful swells. The first warning came at 4:47 p.m., when a larger wave crashed behind her, soaking her equipment and jolting her from her scientific trance. Looking up for the first time in over an hour, Madison felt a chill of recognition. The water level had risen dramatically, and waves were now breaking much closer to her position. She quickly began gathering her equipment, her movements becoming frantic as she realized the danger. The massive sneaker wave that struck moments later was estimated at 15 feet high. Madison had no time to react as the wall of water crashed over her rocky outcrop with tremendous force. The impact swept her off the rocks and into the churning surf, where she was immediately pulled underwater by the powerful undertow. The ocean showed no mercy. Sharp, barnacle-covered rocks became weapons as the waves repeatedly slammed her against the submerged coastline. Severe lacerations opened across her head, arms, and torso, while her heavy, waterlogged clothing dragged her deeper. Despite her swimming ability, Madison could not overcome the combination of her injuries and the relentless ocean forces. The current carried her approximately 200 yards offshore before she finally succumbed to drowning, her body disappearing beneath the dark Pacific waters that had been both her passion and her destroyer. 3 days later, Coast Guard vessels recovered Madison's body. The coroner determined that she had died from drowning, complicated by severe blunt force trauma and blood loss. Madison's death sent shockwaves through the marine biology community at UC Santa Barbara. Her research advisor immediately implemented new safety protocols requiring all coastal fieldwork to be conducted in pairs with emergency communication devices. Her family, determined that their daughter's death would not be in vain, funded the installation of warning signs at the location where Madison died. The signs specifically warn visitors about the danger of sneaker waves, serving as a permanent reminder of how quickly the ocean's beauty can turn deadly. Madison Reeve's unfinished thesis on sea anemone populations was posthumously completed by her colleagues and published in her honor, ensuring that her scientific contributions would live on, even as her promising career was cut tragically short. It was October 11, 2015, when the incident occurred on a private desert trail approximately 40 miles northeast of Barstow in the Mojave Desert, California. The terrain consisted of hard-packed sand interspersed with exposed rock shelves and scattered creosote brush. The afternoon temperature was 87 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies and minimal wind. Visibility extended for miles across the flat basin. The trail had been used informally by off-road enthusiasts for years, with no official maintenance. Silas Clay, 51 years old, worked in venture finance, managing investment portfolios for private clients. He was known among his peers as competitive and dismissive of risk, often pushing limits in both professional and personal settings. That day, he had joined a group of 4 friends for high-speed off-road driving. The group had rented modified utility vehicles designed for desert terrain. Each vehicle was equipped with roll cages, but only 2 had full 5-point harnesses. Clay selected a vehicle with a standard lap belt and no shoulder restraint. He also removed his helmet shortly after the group began driving, stating that it obstructed his ability to film the experience. A guide accompanying the group had briefed them on trail conditions before departure. He specifically warned about loose rock shelves that protruded from the sand at irregular intervals, particularly in the northern section. He advised maintaining moderate speeds and staying within visual range of the lead vehicle. Clay disregarded the instructions. Within the first 20 minutes, he had accelerated past the group and was driving alone, approximately a quarter-mile ahead. His vehicle reached speeds estimated at 70 miles per hour based on tire tracks and impact analysis. The front left tire struck a jagged rock outcrop partially buried in the sand. The tire blew out instantly. The vehicle yawed sharply to the left and began to roll sideways. Clay was not secured by a shoulder harness. As the vehicle tilted, he was thrown toward the open side frame. His upper torso exited the vehicle during the first rotation. His back and shoulders struck the ground with significant force. A fraction of a second later, the rear frame of the rolling vehicle came down directly on his chest. The weight of the vehicle, estimated at approximately 2,500 to 3,000 pounds, compressed his rib cage. Multiple ribs on both sides were fractured inward. Both lungs collapsed immediately. His heart sustained severe compression and contusion between the sternum and spine. The vehicle completed 2 full rotations before coming to rest upside down, roughly 30 feet from the initial impact point. Clay's body was pinned partially beneath the rear axle. No movement was observed. The guide and other members reached the scene within 3 minutes. They found Clay unresponsive and not breathing. Emergency services were contacted at approximately 2:34 p.m. A medical helicopter arrived approximately 48 minutes later. Paramedics pronounced Clay dead at the scene. Recovery teams used a portable winch to lift the vehicle off his body. His body was transported by helicopter to a regional facility for autopsy. The autopsy report identified the cause of death as traumatic asphyxiation due to chest compression, with multiple rib fractures, bilateral pulmonary collapse, and cardiac contusion. The medical examiner noted that the absence of a full harness allowed for ejection during the rollover. Silas Clay was confirmed dead from traumatic asphyxiation caused by chest compression during the rollover. Investigators determined that excessive speed, failure to use proper safety restraints, and disregard for terrain warnings directly led to the crash. It was May 14, 2016, in a calm coastal inlet near Clearwater, Florida, where light winds, gentle swells, and warm afternoon conditions drew several recreational boats. Lyle Preston, 36, worked in marine equipment sales and had spent years advising others on safe boating practices, a background that gave him confidence bordering on complacency. Friends described him as someone who trusted experience more than caution, especially on the water. He believed the proposal would be simple and controlled, dismissing the idling engine as a minor detail he could manage. His girlfriend of 3 years sat in the cockpit filming, unaware he planned to propose at the stern. She had previously expressed discomfort around the engine while underway, but assumed he knew what he was doing. The 24-foot center console boat drifted approximately 200 yards from shore with its engine in gear, at idle speed to maintain position against the current. A GoPro camera had been mounted near the engine housing, angled to capture the stern deck area where Lyle intended to propose. The fiberglass deck surface showed typical moisture from spray and humidity, creating a slick coating across the non-skid surface. Lyle had positioned himself near the boat's transom, where the propeller churned steadily beneath the surface, roughly 3 feet below the deck level. The engine's idle speed maintained just enough thrust to counteract the inlet's gentle current, keeping the boat stationary while the propeller remained fully engaged and continuing to rotate beneath the surface. As his girlfriend began recording from the cockpit, Lyle moved into his planned position at the stern. The GoPro captured him preparing to lower himself to one knee on the wet fiberglass surface. The boat's gentle rocking motion, combined with the slippery deck conditions, created an unstable platform for his intended proposal stance. While transitioning to the kneeling position, Lyle's right knee lost traction on the moisture-covered fiberglass. His foot slipped sideways, causing him to lose balance and fall backward off the stern platform. The fall carried him directly into the water behind the boat, where the propeller continued rotating beneath the surface. The spinning blades made immediate contact as Lyle entered the water. The propeller's position and the boat's movement brought him into multiple rapid propeller strikes within seconds of entering the water. The injuries occurred within the first few seconds of water entry, causing severe trauma to his torso and extremities. Lyle briefly broke the surface, visible in the GoPro footage, before losing consciousness and movement. His girlfriend immediately moved toward the engine controls, but required several seconds to locate and engage the kill switch. The engine continued running for several seconds before the kill switch was engaged and the propeller stopped. Several nearby boaters already navigating the inlet witnessed the incident and responded within minutes, approaching carefully to avoid further injury. They managed to pull Lyle aboard their vessel and immediately began transport toward the nearest dock while radioing emergency calls. His girlfriend followed in the original boat after the engine was secured and the propeller disengaged. Emergency medical personnel met the rescue boat at the marina, but pronounced Lyle deceased due to massive trauma consistent with propeller strike injuries. The investigation confirmed that the combination of wet deck conditions, boat motion, and proximity to an engaged propeller created the fatal circumstances. Marine safety investigators used the footage to reconstruct the exact sequence of events, determining that the engine remained in gear at the time of the fall. The case was closed as an accidental death caused by unsafe positioning near an engaged propeller.